LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains references to suicide, graphic descriptions of violence against women, and sexual assault. If you're in danger and need support, dial 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732. On the 3rd of March 2021, a 33-year-old woman was kidnapped and murdered in South London. Her name was Sarah Everard. She was born in Surrey and was a talented marketing assistant. A week after her disappearance, a police officer, Wayne Couzens, was arrested and charged. The case became a watershed moment in the UK, devastating the community and leaving the nation understandably distrusting of the police. Steve Gaskin, a former detective, became obsessed with the case and the failings of the Met Police that led to Sarah's murder. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives.
There had been, in my experience and my memory, going back in time, even though I'm retired and I belong to a retired Met Police Detective Association, we all hung our heads in shame. The fact that a serving Metropolitan Police officer was able to plan, use subterfuge, use his badge, for want of a better word, and then take this poor young woman off the streets to a secluded area in Kent, and then to murder her, try and destroy her body by fire, is just unthinkable, I think, for a police officer, members of the public, psychologists, and it put the confidence in the Metropolitan Police hugely back. So that begs the question, doesn't it then, what psychometrics or what screening or vetting can be brought to bear to stop this happening again? The concerning thing with the police is there were two errors in my view. Is first of all, Wayne Couzens had been up to indecently assaulting women, exposing himself, flashing, taking his trousers down and everything that goes with that frightening experience for women. And he had the nickname on his shift, and listen to this if you will, called the Rapist. My criticism of the Met, I was a sergeant, and if I'd had a constable under my command, I would go round this shift or this relief or group of police officers that work homogeneously together and ask, why has that guy got that nickname? That was never asked. Secondly, Wayne Couzens had exposed himself at two McDonald's restaurants. And on both occasions, or certainly on one, the registration number of his car was found. And this murder of this particular woman could have been prevented, in my view. So here we have Wayne Couzens, and what he did is he lied to his wife. This goes back to the roots of the offender behaviour. He lies to his wife and said he was actually rostered to be off duty. Lied to his wife and said he's doing some overtime with the Rorty diplomatic group. So you can see this guy is preparing for something. A lot of people say that serial killers or killers want to be caught. I disagree with that. They don't want to get caught. There's one or two that will taunt the investigating officer. But he's a serving, warranted police constable, and he well knows that there is ANPR automatic number plate retrieval following cars in London. He well knows that, but despite that, and I use these words very, very forcefully, he went hunting during the lockdown for a victim. And what he did, and I find this as a psychologist fascinating, he started going over to crossing a bridge that crosses the River Thames to quite an affluent area of Chelsea. And you could see all this being recorded on ANPR. However, for some reason, he wasn't comfortable with that, so he came over to the poorer side, which is an area in London, quite close to the centre, called Clapham. And there he confronted Sarah Everard. It would appear from the evidence that he lied and got his warrant card out and said that she was breaching COVID regulations, got her into the back of a car, and unfortunately the rest is history, because that young woman was raped and murdered by him. So what is curious with this case is Wayne Couzens lived in Kent. So that is in the southern part of the United Kingdom. It's a big port area for ships, freight coming into the United Kingdom. And he bought some land in a place called Hodes Wood, Hodds. And this sounds quite nice, doesn't it? Oh, and when I looked at it from Google Maps, it looked great. But when you have a close look, it's like a big rubbish dump. What was he going to do with that? Why did he buy it? Because that is where he took the lifeless body of Sarah Everard, and he tried to set fire to her. And there was very, very good evidence. You can see a particular garage that he's got a petrol can, and he's used that petrol to try and set fire to her. The other thing is, just imagine for one moment that you killed someone accidentally. That's one thing, but then to do it in a planned and methodical way, how would you actually feel about that? Well, Couzens, no sooner than he had committed this murder, there is evidence of him going into a service station and buying his breakfast. I find that amazing, really, and that just corroborates in my mind that this guy was displaying criminal psychopathic behaviour. In that, very, very egocentric, very shallow emotions, don't really care about people, it's all about them. So all this behaviour was being displayed, and of course at the time, all of the movements, his movements of not only of his hire car was there, and there was evidence of petrol stations showing that he put a lot of petrol in. So this guy was clearly going to have a long ride, and his behaviour was like a fox. He was literally hunting for a victim, and sadly, had it not been Sarah Everard, it would have been someone else. Two things happened. Is first of all, as a result of this, the investigating officer, as I understand it, from the flashing, came forward and said, we've got this registration number, and it led back to Wayne Couzens. The other thing is that his registration number of the hire car was found, so police were able to go back to the hire car, and he gave his real details. And indeed, the credit card that he used was congruent, and his credit card statement showed all of those events that I've described to you in a line, as it were. So there was, he didn't need to be a Sherlock Holmes to work out that minimal he was a suspect. Fascinatingly, and of course, when he was arrested, what he said is he tried then to distance himself from the whole thing, saying that he was in a lot of financial trouble. This is what he said when he was arrested. You can see it on YouTube. And he said that there was a gang of people from Eastern Europe, this is rubbish, of course, that were controlling him, and said that he had to go out and harness some women so they could be put out as sex workers. That's what he said, which was absolute rubbish, of course, trying to distance himself. The other thing, the final part of the jigsaw, so he had been able to buy this Hodes Wood for cash, and also, curiously, maybe it'd come into some money, he was able to buy his house £200,000. I don't know what that is in Australian dollars, but he paid for this cash. Well, if he had not pleaded guilty, the Met would have put on a forensic financial investigator to look at that, to see how come he'd been able to pay for that. But that never came out because he pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty to murder, but when you look at the ingredients of murder, it's obviously an unlawful act which is premeditated that brings along the death of someone. The actual evidence of murder, of planning it, yes, he was going to kidnap someone, yes, he was going to rape someone, but the evidence for murder was very, very thin. However, he pleaded guilty, and he could have pleaded not guilty because he would have got the same sentence, whole life sentence. But here's the interesting thing, and this spans lots of serial killers, and this is what interests me. In the judge's sentencing, he said, "I've no idea why you did this." And that is congruent with other serial killers. Ted Bundy, over here, we had 2 nurses that have been convicted. Levi Belfield, no one actually knows why they did it. So what would be useful, particularly as we get, and I'm not wandering off here, particularly as we're starting to get into artificial intelligence and criminal investigation, it would be well worthwhile getting a psychologist to go along and interview these people and ask them why they did it. And with Dr. Harold Shipman, again, one of the world's most prolific killers, the public inquiry did exactly what I suggested and sent a psychologist and a psychiatrist and said, "Look here, you've killed 216 of your patients. Why did you do that?" And he said, "F off, I'm not talking to you." Took his own life the following week.
Interesting, with your policing background and now active as a psychologist, is getting in front of an offender such as Wayne Couzens, and of course you can't determine how or what amount of information he would provide, but it would be interesting from a profiling perspective, but also I would imagine too, if you can gather enough of that information, it could be another tool in the toolbox for investigators, couldn't it? Just having that, a little bit of additional knowledge from convicted offenders, be they killers, serial offenders, sex offenders, as to around motive and what drives them. That's got to be useful at some aspects of investigation, I would think, as well.
Very, very much so. And I think we need to get to the point over here where you have got, if you've got a serial murder case running, is you need to have a behavioural science running alongside that investigation, at least not advising the investigating officer, but giving that investigating officer information so they can then act on that if they think that's the right way forward in the investigation.
In 1998, you're a senior detective in the London Met Police when you reviewed a cold case relating to the rape and murder of 2 women dating back to 1975. Can you chat to us about that case and your involvement in it, Steve?
I was a detective chief inspector. What does that mean? I had a command of 140 staff in the London Borough of Hounslow, and that's very close to Heathrow Airport. So my job was I was responsible for all crime in that borough. So I was fairly new and I'd set my stall out, and we actually reduced crime, volume crime, burglary, motor vehicle theft and everything. And one day I said to my 3 deputies, DIs, on Monday morning I want on my desk any outstanding murder in the last 25 years, because as a team we're going to review them. I've got to say, in some ways, that was the biggest mistake I ever made, because on the Monday morning, a Pantechnicon load of paper turned up, because at that time, we investigated murders in the 70s using a paper system. And it wasn't till the advent of Holmes, which was a bit of software, Home Office Large Major Inquiry System, that we put it onto IT, which was a fantastic and still is a good system. So in came these cases, and what I did, the 2 that I looked at were a young woman called Lynn Whedon. She was 16 years of age, And on an arterial road to the airport and into central London, on a side street, she was brutally raped and murdered and thrown into an electricity substation. That was the first one. The second one was a woman called Elizabeth Paravicini. She went up to see some ex-colleagues in London, came back to the suburbs, got off the train and was murdered 3 streets away from where she lived. And very, very sadly, it was her father that found her murdered in the street. And there was an attempt to seriously sexually assault her. So in a murder case or a murder file, there was a report from the senior officer that investigated it. There was a shed load of witness statements, photographs and any other material. So if you can imagine, these cases were about 1 foot each or 30 centimetres of paper. So we had to wade through those. And we managed to put 2 together. And in fairness, there had been a connection between these 2. But as I started reading, the turning point, as I started reading through the case papers, I saw a statement, some evidence from my best mate, a guy called Tim, who was still a serving officer. I wasn't in the police service in 1975, so I hadn't even joined. But he was on the original inquiry and he was serving on our anti-terrorist branch. So I got hold of him and said, Tim, get over to Hounslow now. I need to talk to you. And he said, oh, we're going out for a drink or a social. I said, no, we're not. I need your opinion on this case. So I'd kind of come up with a theory and an opinion. And I said to him, I want you to write down on a piece of paper who you think is responsible. He did, and it accorded with what my thinking was at the time. And that was, those 2 names were a serving Metropolitan Police officer. This particular guy, and I'm not going to mention his name, the irony is I'd actually served with him in central London in the 80s. So I finished off as a DCI, I was a detective constable, and this guy had been removed from the Metropolitan Police Service after 2 years' service for, if you don't mind, indecently assaulting one of his supervising officers. So he left the force and went out quickly. Some 5 years later, and I'm going to paraphrase with this, some 5 years later, and please hear me clearly, all serious sexual assaults are a nightmare. They're terrible for the victim, they're terrible for the family, you have to give evidence. This guy was the worst of the worst, lying in wait in a social club car park with a large knife and a ski mask on, waiting for a victim. And that's exactly what he did, is he raped a woman in a car park. And to cut a long story short, there was an investigation and he was caught. But when he was caught, they searched his house and in there they found an old inspector's police uniform. He wasn't an inspector, he'd stolen that. And also some police radios. So therefore, that meant that if he was getting up to further offences and behaving in that way, he would be able to listen in to the police traffic and then make good his escape before they came along. So I started doing a profile, then looking at the geography of these 2 attacks, and guess what? This police officer lived in the epicentre of where these 2 attacks had taken place. And furthermore, from the inquiries I made, he and his reporting sergeant lived very, very close together, so they were able to share lifts into their duties. So this is where we are. Now, the most frustrating thing is that he was sent to prison for 5.5 years, which seems to me, to bearing in mind that behaviour carries a maximum of life imprisonment in the UK, that seems to me to be quite a light sentence. The frustrating thing is about this time that the police and indeed the prison service were routinely taking DNA samples. And there was DNA from both scenes of the 70s murders. And to the credit of the Metropolitan Police, they kept that evidence in a secure cavern. So this is what we had. So anyway, leading on from that, so I carried on this investigation until I retired. Safe to say, as far as I came from my inquiries, this is the only outstanding serial killing in London. So that serial killing, 3 or more people murdered over a period of 3 weeks or more, which puts this police officer into that category. My other inquiries find out that this character used to befriend high schools, particularly girls' high schools, and he was a good skier and volunteer to take these girls skiing. Well, my inquiries found that in Italy, when he was on one of these trips, a young woman, Italian woman, was found battered and murdered 2 streets away from where he was on holiday with these girls. That might be coincidence, but all of this mounting up doesn't seem to me to be coincidence. So the next thing I know, and this is purely by chance, is 3 years ago in retirement, I meet in Norfolk, where I live, which is a small area, I meet 2 people by chance, both former DCIs, the same rank as me, and one of them tells me, he said, "Oh, I remember your cold case. We had a look at that. There's a DNA connection now with the more sort of modern science between Lynn Weedon in West London and a Playboy Bunny Club woman." What I mean by that, these women used to dress up as rabbits and act as croupiers, Playboy magazine and all that. But the frustrating thing is, of course, there's no perpetrator, so it just shows a link. So, and also at the time of the murder of this woman, there's another croupier. So it looks like it would appear that there's 4 murders. Now, one of my colleagues, a guy called Colin Sutton, who I do a lot of business with, he was about to undertake a reinvestigation on that, but then he was called off onto another serial killing case with a chap called Levi Belfield. When Belfield struck for the first time, I was a DCI carrying the whole of West London, covering that, and I dealt with the sort of first aid of the first attack. So that's where we are at the moment. When we did the programme on the TV's Playboy Bunny Club murders, we asked for a comment from the Met, and as I understand it, they're looking at familial DNA, but the character, my inquiries tell me that the character I believe is concerned, I might be wrong, is living in a country where there's no extradition. And that is the most frustrating thing, certainly in my career.
The DNA that's linking these cases together, or the offender of these cases, is currently, it's probably sitting in a refrigerated environment somewhere, I'd imagine, is it, as a cold case piece of evidence. And you're saying that this individual who you think may be responsible is now ensconced in a country where he can't be extradited from.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. Now, you see, if I was still a police officer, I'd know what I would do, and that is I would send a covert team into the area that he lives in, follow him around, and I remember the time he was smoking, he might have stopped that. He's 67, 68 years of age now, or follow him into a pub or anything where you could get DNA and bring that back. And sometimes the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK has approached countries where there is a fugitive, even though there's no extradition, and sometimes politically that can be resolved. But of course, I'm not a warranted police officer anymore.
Obvious question from there then, Steve. What is it that's preventing them from doing something like that in a case such as this?
I think it's also weighing up with a cold case, and I speak extensively on cold case investigations. What you have to look at a number of variables. First of all, what's the appetite to bring this case on? Secondly, and very sadly, you have to look at the cost. Thirdly, and critically, where are the people that would give the evidence to convict him at a British court? Fourthly, are they still alive? And then fifthly is sort of is keeping up with the victims' relatives and listening to their views. So I was asked a question, and in fact I'll repeat that, is if he was arrested and brought to this country, what is the chance of a conviction? Well, I would say less than 50%. So unless, and the Crown Prosecution Service, when they look at whether to continue a case or not, will look at, is there enough evidence with a properly directed jury to convict? If not, they won't go for it. It's a waste of time.
The DNA might be a match, but I guess I'm taking from what you're saying that there'd still be a few holes that need to be filled in to get it up in front of a jury.
Yeah, be very, very nothing wrong with circumstantial evidence, but you would have to have quite an amount of circumstantial evidence to support the DNA. And if the DNA was ruled inadmissible, then that would probably be the end of the case.
And we are talking, if we look at the original case back to 75, goodness me, it's close to 50 years.
I mean, one of the good things, at least, and I know that the Metropolitan Police Service, Scotland Yard in London, at least we will keep these cases on the books, and that's a positive. That is very, very much a positive, so that, murder cases are never closed. They may be put into suspended animation, but if further clues come along or the case is reopened from a cold case like I did, then they will pursue it, and that's to the credit of the police.
Steve, you mentioned a prolific serial offender, Levi Belfield. Can you just fill in a few gaps around that for us with that individual?
Yeah, again, a lot of coincidences here. I used to live in West London, again, fairly close to Heathrow, and I had 3 young daughters, and there was a serial killer operating in that area. In other words, 3 young women had been murdered, and one had been gratuitously knocked over with a car. So Levi Belfield was a clamper, Denver boots onto cars and that sort of thing. And basically, on my first day as a DCI, Detective Chief Inspector, I was covering the whole of West London, and this guy struck for the first time. He hit a young woman over the head with a brick in broad daylight. Now, that makes me think, as I used to think just purely like a police officer, but then I started thinking like a psychologist, and when the two clashed, that was a really, really good sort of situation. So you've got to ask yourself what type of person would do that in broad daylight. And secondly, he was a passenger. So what type of person would drive someone and not tell the police that? So that was the extent there. So my interest in Levi Belfield is more around psychopathy. So my 2 skills are looking at criminal psychopathy and also offender profiling. So the investigation was undertaken by a very, very good friend of mine, and remarkably, we retired to Norfolk and we lived within 5 miles of each other. What's the chances of that in a much smaller country than Australia? However, Colin Sutton took on this case, and he managed to arrest, charge and convict Levi Belfield on no forensic evidence whatsoever. He was known as the bus stop murderer. The press always give these labels, and that is because he used to chat up or try and procure his victims at bus stops. So that is Levi Belfield. So Colin Sutton undertook this investigation, and it went to court, and he was convicted of 3 murders and given 3 whole life sentences.
Steve, if I could take you back to 1986, police received a tip-off about a suspicious delivery of a 50-litre barrel of BMK, which is a chemical used to produce a drug, amphetamine sulfate, or speed as it's known, perhaps more locally. You led the investigation into this case. It was an interesting one. Steve, can you fill in some gaps there for us?
We got wind in 1986 that this barrel of benzyl methyl ketone, we'll call it BMK from now on, was due to be delivered at an address in London. There are no legitimate uses for that, save to make amphetamine sulfate or speed. Over here in the UK, it's designated as a Class A drug, and the penalty for supplying that is 14 years imprisonment. So it's considered very serious. So this was a small phone call, yeah? That's all it is. And I'll leave you to work out where some of this intelligence came from. So we got authority from some senior police officers to deliver that barrel ourselves. And obviously, you need to be a bit careful there. The law over here says that if an offence is laid on, which it was in this case, then we could behave in that particular manner. So the good news for us is we were able to photograph. So we delivered it ourselves, pretending to be from this particular chemical company that no longer exists. 50 litres, so that's a lot of BMK. So we delivered it, so we knew who the principal was straight away. We were able to then conduct some observation, photographs, and see who we were looking at. Then the real hard work went, because you can imagine we then had to track that barrel, and it was almost like the archetypal US TV program where it's 24-hour surveillance, because that's exactly what it was. It was a nightmare. You can imagine with 11 people on my team doing that. That is very, very intensive. We had to use other teams to do that. So we followed that barrel around for a week, and there was quite a lot of pressure on me, but from my bosses saying at some stage we're going to have to make the decision whether or not to continue tracking that barrel, because it's no offence to have the chemical. It's only an offence when it goes into production. So we tracked this barrel, and eventually it went into a pub. And that's when I started thinking, why is it going into a pub? And, you probably in Australia have some like big manhole covers near pubs and bars. It opens up from the street and the goods go down. And that's exactly what happened. So we were able to photograph this barrel going down. So that was the exciting part, into a pub basement or cellar. So you know that something's going to go on there. We also did some inquiries and found out that, your chemistry equipment, like when you're at school, all of that had been delivered to the pub. So that was really a very, very good clue that something was going to happen. The glassware from a chemical company plus the BMK. And it was at that point that I had to wander into another area of expertise. I wanted to know from the time that the barrel went down there, if they started production immediately, how long would that take before it was in production? That's a really hard call, because all we could see was people going into the pub, some people legitimately for a drink, but some people, suspects, could be going into the pub and then down into the cellar. So that was a really, really hard call. I was a detective sergeant then, and my boss, a great guy, detective inspector, he said, come on then, what do we think? So I said, look, let's leave it as we've been advised for 24 hours, keep it under surveillance and see what goes from there. So at that point, we got a search warrant, and on that, I put that we wanted to use force, if necessary, to get into the pub. Oh, I tell you what, so you can imagine we got a lot of people together, and we were into that pub within seconds, literally, into that pub, and we went down to the basement, and it was in production, which is good. So it looked like the mad professor, if you like, chemistry thing, and it was in production, and there were 2 or 3 people down there when we arrived, which was really good news, including the guy from where we delivered it from. So again, there was a good bit of circumstantial evidence there. Why would the guy that was receiving it be at the place where it was being produced? I've got to say, it was, in terms of adrenaline, it was so exciting, but I suppose that comes with part of the job. But at the same time, and I said earlier on, we're an unarmed police force, so you have to be very, very careful. We went in there unarmed, completely unarmed, and we calculated with the help of this analytical chemist that it could yield £1 million worth of product. Anyway, we got down there, and it was I've just walked down here. I got the wrong, I wanted to find the toilet, and that's all 3 of them telling me that, typical sort of stuff. But the turning point is I noticed in the bin that the labels that were on the side of the barrel had been removed. Anyway, so I called for a crime scene investigator. who worked at the drug squad with us, she came along and took possession of those labels. Now, this was the exciting part, because on the inside, or the sticky part of a label, so where it'd be ripped off, not on the outside, but on the inside, was the main principal's fingerprints. That is really damning evidence. I was so excited by that. And secondly, there were fingerprints from two of the people that were there on the glassware. So again, pretty good evidence. You know, I suppose you could have said, well, I was just looking at it. Well, it was hot, you know. This stuff had got a big electric current going through it, and some of the stuff was hot. Furthermore, and I suppose this is the best bit of detection I've ever done, I loved being a DCI, so I was in charge of detectives. They did the detecting, I did the HR. But I found an envelope that had been ripped in half, and the postal mark had been ripped in half. But what I noticed is that there was some handwriting on there, which was quite stylistic, if you like. Anyway, when we searched the woman's house that was present at the scene, we found one or two things, but we didn't find anything else. But it wasn't until she signed for her property that I realised that her handwriting was from half the envelope that we found at the crime scene. So in terms of conspiracy, we then researched her house and found the other half of the envelope, and they fitted together nicely. And on the back of that envelope of the crime scene, she had written some of the ingredients used for this. Oh, I tell you, I couldn't tell you how excited I was. And I remember one of my bosses saying, they can't fool you, can they? But that seriously, that sort of evidence doesn't come every minute of the day. So I was actually quite pleased with that. They were then arrested, taken to separate police stations so they couldn't shout to each other down the cell passages. They were interviewed, and they were charged with conspiracy to produce amphetamine sulfate. And as I said on the programme that's just about to come out, and all the violence and all the corruption that goes with that. That's the important thing to know. I mean, I've seen people killed because, you know, that thing was in production. I've seen other drug dealers that will come in and just wipe up the people and steal the drugs. So there's all that goes with it. We were assigned a very, very good barrister. Really, really good. Very, very good barrister who now sits as a judge. I think she may have retired, but she was brilliant. Anyway, so we had 5 people in the dock. The trial lasted for 2 or 3 weeks. The jury went out, and guess what? They couldn't agree. I was devastated. I thought there was enough evidence there. So in the UK, you need at least 10 people either way as a majority to convict or acquit. This is known as a hung jury, so there's an imbalance. I was devastated. So anyway, the Crown Prosecution Service, the solicitors, if you like, decided that they were going to go for it again, which is quite unusual. Anyway, we did, and this time a fresh jury came back and convicted them.
These 5 offenders received custodial sentences ranging from 7 through to 14 years. Is that correct, Steve? Because that's a pretty good result.
Yeah. So you can see how that was viewed by the Crown or the people, you know.
Steve, since leaving the job after 30 years service to the Met Police, you've been involved. You know, you certainly haven't let the grass grow under your feet. You've picked up a couple of degrees here and there, and you do a lot of presenting around psychology of offenders, investigation techniques, and what have you. Just wondering, Steve, if for the benefit of our listeners, have you got anything sort of coming up in the near future that you think would be of interest to those who like true crime?
We've got a really cool tour that myself and Colin Sutton are doing in the UK called Manhunter and Mindhunter. And I'd dearly like, that's a 2-hour, 2-man theatre production. I'd dearly like to get that into Australia in the future. That is around the investigation of a prolific serial killer and the psychology that goes with it. But what I have got coming up on the 15th of November is I'm going to do a live experience online through a company called Class Bento, which is an experience company, which I've done a lot of work in. It's called How to Investigate a Serial Killer. So why would you want to listen to that for an hour? And it's a paid service. Is where do you start with a serial killing? You learn the critical first steps in launching an investigation into a serial killing. And then I'm going to take you inside an investigation of a serial killing. You get a true insight, how they're managed by the police, how I've managed them, from the crime scene to the courtroom.
Steve, it's been a great pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us from the UK there. And it's been a wonderful insight into the work that you've done, and a 30-year career in the Met Police. Thank you for your service to the good people of London and environs, and also, Steve, the work that you continue to do. You've got such a passion for it, and there's such an interest in this, and you're out and about providing a lot of information for people, and it's just been great to meet you, and thank you so much for coming in and having a chat.
Yeah, likewise. Been a pleasure to help.
Crime Insiders Detectives is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Brent Sanders, and produced by Ed Gooden and Holly Mitchell. Executive producer is Dan Mullins. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.